Imagine for a second um, that you're holding the original master blueprints to just this completely revolutionary hospital.
Right, like a literal state-of-the-art facility.
Exactly. A facility capable of curing literally every disease that plagues your entire city. And the plans, I mean, they're immaculate.
Down to the last detail.
Yeah. They detail the surgical bays, the sanitation systems, the logistics for delivering medicine, even the exact structural engineering you'd need to keep the roof from caving in.
Which is pretty important for a hospital.
Right. But now imagine that instead of taking those blueprints, pouring the concrete, laying the foundation, and actually building the thing to cure the sick people dying in the streets outside.
Instead of actually doing the work.
Yeah, instead of doing the work, you and your community decide to take those blueprints and, frame them in gold.
Oh, wow.
You hang them on the wall.
Oh.
And you just gather around them every morning to trace the lines of the ink with your fingers.
Maybe chant the dimensions of the hallways?
Yes. You chant the dimensions of the hallways, and you just sort of hope that the drawing itself is going to heal you.
Which, I mean, when you put it that way, it sounds like absolute madness.
It sounds completely ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's this tragic, almost comical failure to understand what a blueprint is actually for.
Right, because a blueprint isn't the building.
Exactly. It's the instruction manual for the building.
And that really is exactly what we're unpacking today. Welcome to the deep dive.
Yes, welcome. Because today, we are asking a really highly provocative question of you, the listener. And that question is, why do we recite these verses for, personal blessings, while completely failing to implement the socioeconomic justice they explicitly demand?
It's a huge question.
It's massive. We're unpacking this really fascinating, paradigm-shifting set of notes and lectures today. It details the rationalist school of Allama G. Parwez, specifically focusing on his commentary on Surah Al-Imran, verses 98 to 104.
And the core argument we are exploring today is that humanity has just fallen into this massive, naive misconception.
Historically massive.
Absolutely. We have taken a civilizational blueprint that was designed to construct a highly functional socioeconomic state, and we've basically downgraded it into a mere religious placeholder.
And to really wrap our heads around how that happened, how we downgraded it so badly, we have to look at the distinction the source material makes between two fundamental concepts.
Right, Deen and Mazhab.
Yeah, Deen and Mazhab. These are words that get thrown around a lot, right? Often interchangeably in modern conversations.
All the time. People think they mean the exact same thing.
But in the context of this rationalist analysis, they are essentially opposites.
Completely, because, well, Deen represents a unified collective system of life.
It's the hospital actually being built and functioning.
Exactly. It encompasses economics, politics, law, and social welfare into just one indivisible whole. It is literally a socio-political constitution.
Whereas Mazhab.
Mazhab, on the other hand, is what happens when that system degrades. It is the framed blueprint on the wall.
It becomes this fragmented, individualized religion, right? Focused strictly on rituals, dogma, and personal salvation.
Yeah. And what is so incredibly compelling about this source material is how it diagnoses the psychology behind that transition.
Right, because moving from Deen to Mazhab, that isn't an accident.
Not at all. It happens because building and maintaining a socioeconomic state, ensuring that your neighbor is fed, that justice is upheld, that wealth isn't hoarded, that is incredibly difficult.
It requires real sacrifice.
Sacrifice, systemic oversight, constant collective effort. But Mazhab, individualized religion, that is much easier.
It's psychologically comfortable.
Precisely. It allows an individual to perform a set of physical rituals, feel this profound sense of spiritual accomplishment, and then
just walk past a starving person on the street without feeling any systemic accountability.
Exactly. It completely absolves you of the heavy lifting. You can just retreat into your personal piety.
Now, before we dive into the specific mechanics of how this text says we are actually supposed to build this state, it is super important to lay out exactly what kind of architecture we are looking at here.
Because it's not what most people are used to.
No, not at all. We are looking at blueprints that call for the total constitutional abolition of democratic political parties, opposition factions, and localized sectarian jurisprudence.
It is a radical departure from almost every modern political system in existence today.
So just a quick disclaimer for you listening. Our job today isn't to tell you if this is politically right or wrong.
Right, we're not endorsing any modern left-wing or right-wing structures.
Exactly. We aren't taking sides. We are just here to read the blueprints and figure out exactly what the architect was aiming for. We're just exploring the original ideological arguments from the text for your own intellectual curiosity.
And if we really want to understand the architect's true intentions, we have to recognize that the very vocabulary used in these blueprints has been, well, it's been fundamentally altered over centuries.
The words themselves have been detached from their systemic meanings.
Yeah, and wrapped in this thick layer of ritualistic mysticism. So to move from the framed drawing back to the construction site, we really have to use the linguistic key provided in the text.
Let's start with a term that almost everyone who is familiar with this topic thinks they understand.
Al-Kitab.
Al-Kitab, traditionally translated as people of the book. Now, the conventional view treats this as basically a historical noun.
A relic of the past.
Yeah, a relic. If you read a standard commentary, it assumes this phrase refers strictly to ancient communities, specifically Jews and Christians of antiquity. It's treated as a history lesson about people who lived, a very long time ago.
But Parwez's rational extraction completely shatters that localized historical view.
How so?
Well, he argues that interpreting it as a historical relic is actually part of the mazhab trap. It makes the text safe. It makes it about them, not us.
Oh, wow.
Right. Instead, the analysis reveals that Ali-e-Kitab is a universal mental state.
A mental state.
Yeah. It is a psychological profile that emerges in literally any era, among any people, when a society degrades that unified deen into a fragmented mazhab.
So it's not a noun describing a specific ancient tribe. It's a condition.
Exactly. It's the mindset of people who use human-made religious traditions to bypass a unified divine constitution.
The source material is totally unsparing on this point, honestly. It argues that Muslims today, who follow a prevalent ritualistic version of Islam, operate entirely on this exact al-Kitab mindset.
Which is a tough pill to swallow.
It's a massive claim. They fabricate self-crafted beliefs, attribute them to God to give them ultimate authority, mix objective truth with subjective falsehood, and then they divide the community into competing sects.
And the ultimate irony, according to the text, is that they falsely claim this division is somehow a divine mercy.
That completely changes how you interact with the text. I mean, it means the blueprints aren't warning you about a rival construction company from 1,000 years ago.
No, they are holding up a mirror to your own engineers today.
Which brings us to a concept that I think perfectly captures the insidious nature of this mindset. The word is iwaj.
Iwaj, yes.
Traditionally, the notes indicate this is translated simply as crookedness or, morally straying from the right path.
Right, but the linguistic root is much more specific and, frankly, much more dangerous than just straying.
How do you mean?
Well, the root distinguishes between visible, physical crookedness, like a bent stick, which anyone can plainly see, is broken, and structural, imperceptible deviation.
Imperceptible.
Yes. That structural deviation is iwaj. It is a deviation that is intentionally introduced into the system but remains completely invisible to the masses who are actively participating in it.
I'm trying to picture what that actually looks like in practice.
Yeah.
Because an invisible deviation sounds almost like, a conspiracy theory until you actually map it out.
It does sound wild, but think about a standard navigational compass.
Okay, a compass.
If someone takes a hammer and smashes the glass and breaks the needle, you know the compass is destroyed.
Right, that's obvious. Visible crookedness, you wouldn't trust it.
Exactly. But iwaj is like someone taking a tiny, powerful magnet and slowly rubbing it against the side of the compass housing while you aren't looking.
Oh, wow.
Right. The compass still looks perfectly intact, the glass is clear, the needle still swings freely, and it still points in a direction. But it has been fundamentally demagnetized.
It is no longer pointing to true north.
No. It is leading you maybe 1 or 2 degrees off course, and in the short term, you don't even notice.
But over a journey of 100 miles.
Over 100 miles, you are going to walk straight off a cliff, fully believing you were following the right path the entire time.
That is such a chilling analogy, and that is the exact mechanism of iwaj. The compass looks intact, so you feel perfectly secure.
And in the context of the source material, the sectarian leaders, the ones operating with that Ali-Kitab mindset, they introduce iwaj by keeping the outward physical shell of divine commands completely pristine.
So they don't tell you to stop performing the rituals.
Oh, definitely not. In fact, they might encourage you to perform them even more rigorously. but they entirely strip away the systemic socioeconomic objective behind those commands.
Let's look at a concrete example of this from the notes, because this is where it gets really real.
Mm-hmm.
How does this structural deviation affect something as fundamental as daily practices? Like, what about salat, the daily prayers?
Oh, salat is the quintessential example.
Because currently, that's universally understood as a deeply personal, individual ritual worship, right?
Right. It is the perfect example of the compass being demagnetized. The text brings up the command of iqamat as-salat. Today, under the influence of mazhab, salat is treated as an individual obligation to appease God through specific physical postures.
But Parwez argues that this is just the result of iwaj.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He argues salat has been downgraded from an administrative system into a sectarian identifier.
A sectarian identifier. You mean like a tribal uniform?
Essentially, yes. The source material points out that in the modern era, you can often tell exactly which sect a person belongs to, whether they are Hanafi, Ali Hadith, Shia, or Sunni, simply by watching the minute details of how they stand.
Like how they fold their arms, where they place their hands, or how they position their feet during salat.
Yes. The ritual itself, which was originally designed to unify, has been weaponized into a flag of division. It's basically a way of signaling, I belong to this specific faction and I do not belong to yours.
So the compass still looks like a compass. Millions of people are still physically facing the exact same direction, the Qibla. They're still performing the coordinated physical movements. But the needle is pointing toward factionalism instead of unity.
That is exactly it. The source material reclaims salat as a functional, systemic, state-level mechanism.
So it's not just a ritual.
No, in a true deen, salat is not just a personal, quiet time with the Creator. It is an administrative tool meant to centralize the ummah, the community, and eradicate the friction of societal division.
Think of it as a daily, synchronized assembly of the entire population.
Right. If you are all physically facing the same center, the symbolic qibla, the systemic objective, is that you must also be economically, legally, and politically unified by an actual functioning central authority.
Retaining the physical act of facing a stone building in Mecca while maintaining deep socioeconomic inequality and sectarian hatred in your own neighborhood, I mean, that is the ultimate manifestation of iwaj.
You are tracing the lines on the blueprint, but you are actively refusing to build the hospital.
But, okay, if salat was originally designed to be this localized administrative assembly that feeds into a massive, centralized socioeconomic engine,
Right.
then logically there has to be an actual center running that engine.
Right, you need a hub.
You can't have a centralized administrative system without a central executive authority to, process the data, distribute the resources, and enforce the rules.
And that realization leads us directly into how the source material defines authority, the concept of the messenger, and what it views as the absolute treason of sectarianism.
Which is a really intense way to phrase it, the treason of sectarianism.
It is, but to understand the mechanics of this central authority, we have to examine the Arabic term rasuluhu.
Which translates to his messenger.
Right. Now, the traditional mazhab view struggles immensely with the wording in verse 3.101. The verse addresses the believers and asks, how can you disbelieve while the verses of Allah are recited to you and his messenger is among you?
And there's an obvious chronological problem there.
Exactly.
The historical prophet, the man himself, passed away over a millennium ago. So if you are a person reading this text today and it explicitly says the messenger is among you, how does traditional ritualistic thought reconcile that when the physical person is demonstrably not there?
Well, the historical reality is that when the original central state authority, what the text calls the markaz, collapsed in the centuries following the prophet's death, the society fractured.
The centralized socioeconomic engine completely broke down.
It did. And the sectarian thinkers who emerged from that collapse, they had to find a substitute to fill the void of authority. And according to Parwez's analysis, they used iwaj to solve the problem.
There's that invisible deviation again.
Exactly. They falsely claimed that the messenger among us referred to static, individualized collections of oral traditions and historical hearsay.
Hadith books.
Right, the hadith books, which were compiled centuries later.
So instead of an active, living, sociopolitical system that could actually respond to real-time crises, they substituted a library of historical anecdotes.
Yes, and the systemic consequence of that substitution was just catastrophic, because Different sects authenticated different books, Bukhari for some, Tirmidhi for others, Al-Kafi for others. They effectively created thousands of competing, individualized messengers.
Which shatters the unity. If your sect follows one set of historical anecdotes and my sect follows another, we no longer share the same authority.
The single unified center was completely destroyed.
Okay, so how does the rationalist extraction actually define Rasuhu then? If it's not the historical books of tradition, and the physical prophet has obviously died, what is this messenger that is still supposed to be among you?
In Parwez's framework, the messenger signifies the continuous living constitutional system.
So it's a system, not a person.
Exactly. It is the Markaz Imalat, the central authority that actively enforces the Book of Allah in real time. The physical death of the prophet does not and cannot terminate the system.
Because his role as the enforcer of the Constitution is supposed to be succeeded by an active, centralized state authority.
An authority acting strictly within his paradigm, yes.
I see. So the role of the messenger isn't just to be like a spiritual postman who delivers the mail and then leaves.
I love that analogy, no?
The role is the office of the executive. It is the institution that executes the instructions in the mail. And once the original mortal executor passes away, the office itself must remain open, filled by a continuous unified system.
That is what the text implies by the law of systemic continuity. A constitution is just a piece of paper. It only lives, it only has actual reality through its enforcing authority.
Right.
Without the markaz, without the state apparatus to actually enforce the equitable distribution of resources, the deen perishes. The hospital is abandoned.
And mazhab individualized religion, where everyone just decides their own rules based on which historical book they prefer, takes over entirely.
And this brings us to some incredibly heavy terminology in the text. We are talking about words like fariq, meaning faction, kufr, meaning disbelief, and shirk, meaning polytheism.
Now, traditionally, polytheism means bowing down to multiple stone idols, right?
Right.
But how does joining a political or religious faction equate to disbelief and polytheism?
Yeah.
Because those are massive, absolute charges to level against someone just for joining a political party.
They are massive charges, but this is where the rationalist approach is remarkably uncompromising. It operates on what we can call the law of indivisibility. Truth, by its very nature, cannot be divided and remain truth. The source material defines iman, or belief, strictly as collective unity under the single divine constitution. Therefore, kufr, or disbelief, is defined in this systemic context as division, factionalism, and sectarianism.
So disbelief isn't just a cognitive state of what you hold in your heart or whether you doubt the existence of a creator. It's a tangible action. It is the act of fragmenting the community.
Yes. The text argues that the Quranic system recognizes absolutely no religious sects and no political opposition parties.
None at all.
None. Both are considered direct, structural rebellions against the indivisible sovereignty of God. Creating religious sects or setting up political opposition parties is structurally equivalent to shirk, polytheism, because you are dividing the ultimate authority.
Okay, I really want to wrestle with this for a minute because abolishing political opposition goes against every instinct of modern democratic theory.
It definitely does.
Modern thought assumes that if you don't have an opposition party to challenge the ruling party, you inevitably end up with tyranny. You end up with a dictatorship. How does this system justify the complete eradication of factions without devolving into an authoritarian nightmare?
Well, the text views democratic factionalism, having a ruling party and an opposition party constantly fighting for power, as a manifestation of Bagyan. Yes, which it defines as the ego-driven desire to dominate others. It even rejects personal laws, meaning it demands a single, unified legal code, completely outlawing the practice of having different legal jurisdictions for different religious sects within the same state.
So no separate rules for separate groups.
Exactly. The logic behind this strict indivisibility, according to the source, is rooted in the nature of power itself. Every faction, by definition, inherently claims a monopoly on salvation or truth.
Right. If my political party believes our way is the only right way, we are structurally incentivized to undermine your party.
Precisely. And that inherently shatters the universal brotherhood required for a functioning system. You simply cannot have a unified, equitable state if the population is structurally incentivized to oppose one another for power and resources.
If you divide the sovereignty of the state into competing factions, you are committing structural polytheism because you are setting up rival authorities alongside the central constitution.
As for the fear of tyranny, the text argues that human dictatorships arise when authority is based on human whim. In the Deen, the central authority is utterly bound by the objective, unchanging laws of the divine constitution.
So the Markaz isn't a dictator, it is the administrative servant of the law.
Exactly. But, of course, a law is only as good as its ultimate objective. You can have absolute unity, but if the objective of that unity is just to enrich the people running the Markaz, you still have a dystopia.
Right.
The source material insists that this intense push for ideological unity isn't just about control for the sake of control. This absolute unity is merely a strict prerequisite for the actual ultimate goal of the entire blueprint.
And that goal is intensely practical, isn't it? Feeding the people.
Yes, it's about ensuring absolute economic fairness.
Which brings us to the very heart of the blueprint, the economic engine, or what the text calls Nizam-e-Rubiyat, the system of providence.
This is where the abstract theology transforms into tangible socioeconomics.
Let's unpack this by looking at a phrase that is incredibly famous in the Islamic world. Hablillah, the rope of Allah, and the concept of ikhwan, which is universally translated as brotherhood.
All right.
When we hear brotherhood today, we think of a feeling. We think of a sentimental, warm emotion toward our neighbor. We are all brothers. It is very internal. It means we smile at each other at community events.
But Parwez reveals the linguistic root of ikhwan, and it completely shatters that purely sentimental view.
What's the root?
Linguistically, the root of the word refers to livestock tethered to a single central rope, sharing their water and provisions equally from a common source.
The visual there is striking, honestly, and it completely upends the modern spiritualized view. It's not about sending thoughts and prayers to your neighbor when they are struggling.
Not at all.
It's about having your bank accounts, your resource distribution, and your access to basic human needs tied to the exact same equitable standard.
Yes.
If you and I are truly ikhwan, it means we are eating from the same trough. If I am hosting a lavish feast in my mansion and you are starving in the street outside, we are not ikhwan, no matter how warmly I smile at you in the mosque, and no matter how many times we pray shoulder to shoulder.
It's a tangible economic reality.
It really is.
It is the law of mutual providence. Brotherhood only actually manifests in reality when resources are shared collectively and equitably.
And to achieve this, the source material dictates that society must actively remove the structural wedges that drive people apart, right?
Yes, and in Arabic, this wedge is termed dawa.
Like a literal wedge used to chop wood.
Exactly like that. A solid piece of iron or wood driven violently into a log to split it apart. The text identifies capitalism, tribalism, nationalism, and sectarianism as these wedges.
Because they split the unified block of humanity into competing, anxious individual egos.
All fighting over scarce resources. The Quranic system aims to pull these wedges out and merge these individual egos back into a collective block, creating what it calls ulfat, genuine mutual affection.
The text uses that beautiful imagery of individuals absorbing into one another like merging rain clouds.
It's very poetic.
But you cannot have merging rain clouds if half the clouds are aggressively hoarding all the water.
Precisely. The economic equity has to come first. It is the engine that makes the unity possible. You can't preach unity to a starving man while you hold all the bread.
And this brings up a massive logistical question. Who actually runs this engine? Who manages the distribution? Because I noticed a very crucial action item in the societal domain section of the notes.
What was it?
It explicitly calls for integrating men and women equally into the state administration.
Oh, yes. This is a vital safeguard in the blueprint. Enforcing the laws of the Constitution and managing this massive economic engine is not the job of a specialized elite. It is the collective duty of the entire population.
So it's not just a boys' club.
No, the source insists that empowering both believing men and believing women to participate equally in the administration of the state prevents a monopoly on power by any specific demographic or clergy.
Meaning you cannot have a specialized religious priesthood dictating the terms of salvation, and you cannot have one gender dominating the administration of the state's resources and laws.
Exactly. The system of providence, the Nizam-e-Rububiyat, requires all hands on deck because everyone is tethered to the exact same rope.
If one group controls the rope, the system collapses into exploitation.
Precisely. If Deen requires the holistic integration of life, it cannot allow the division of reality into the secular and the sacred. You cannot have a society where a religious clergy handles the soul inside the mosque, while secular capitalists handle the economy and the marketplace.
The blueprint demands that all wealth, all resources, and all human effort serve the collective providence of the whole society.
So let's look at the dark side of this equation.
Yeah.
What happens if a society simply ignores this economic engine? What if they keep the wedges firmly in place? They maintain their political factions and their sectarian divides. They allow the economic disparity between the rich and the poor to grow into a chasm, and they just decide to pray harder and perform more rituals to make up for it. Does the blueprint have an answer for that?
Well, the universe, according to the text, has a very unavoidable answer for that. And it is not dependent on abstract theology. It relies on what the notes call social physics.
This is really fascinating framing. Social physics and the law of requital. Usually in traditional religious texts, when a society disobeys, you hear about divine punishment.
Right. You picture an angry deity actively striking people down with lightning bolts or sending plagues because they didn't perform a ritual correctly.
But the rationalist extraction completely reframes this entire concept.
Right.
The law of requital, or the law of action and consequence, is scientific.
Scientific.
Yes, it posits that societies that ignore the objective standard of the book, which is socioeconomic equity and unity, and rely instead on subjective religious fabrications and rituals, will inevitably face systemic failure.
So the punishment, the adhab, isn't a mystical curse falling from the sky.
No, it is the agonizing national decline, the rising crime, the civil unrest, and the mutual destruction caused by economic disparity and factionalism.
The text explicitly mentions a society being on the brink of a pit of fire. For centuries, people operating under the mazhab mindset have read that phrase and immediately thought of the afterlife.
Yeah.
If I sin, I will go to a literal pit of fire after I die. But Parwez is saying, no, look out your window right now. A society that is tearing itself apart through socioeconomic disparity, where children are starving in one neighborhood while billionaires build bunkers in the next, where political factions are at each other's throats violently fighting for power, that society is already standing in the pit of fire.
The punishment is right now, economically and socially.
Yes. The universe operates on unyielding laws. Just as ignoring the law of gravity results in a broken bone if you walk off a roof, ignoring the law of mutual providence results in societal collapse.
You cannot cheat the social physics.
You really can't. Performing 1,000 empty rituals while ignoring their systemic, equitable objectives will never yield the promises of societal ascension. You cannot chant the dimensions of the hospital and expect the bleeding to stop.
So how does a society actually fix this? If they realize they're in the pit of fire, what is the mechanism for pulling themselves out?
That's the big question.
The text brings up the famous Quranic command to enjoin good and forbid evil, Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahi anil Munkar. How does the rationalist school interpret this imperative compared to the traditional view?
This is where we get a profound grammatical lesson that literally changes the entire political structure of the society. It hinges on one Arabic word in verse 3.104.
Just one word.
Just one. The word is min. The traditional view relies on interpreting the Arabic word min as a part of. So they translate the verse as, let there be a group among you who calls to goodness.
So min meaning a subset of the population, a fraction.
Exactly. This interpretation, which is called mini tabid, is structurally used by religious priesthoods to justify their own existence and exclusive role as a specialized class.
Ah, so they become the group among the masses.
Yes. And their job as this specialized class is simply to give verbal sermons or waz about virtue and vice.
So they stand at the pulpit on Friday, tell everyone to be good, honest, and charitable, and then they go home while the secular economy continues to grind the poor into dust.
Exactly. But Parwez argues that linguistically, the min used in this specific verse is mini-tabian.
Mini-tabian.
Yes. It is explanatory. It encompasses the entirety of the subject. It does not mean a part of you. It means you as an entire unified ummah.
Oh, wow. That is a massive shift. So it's not a delegation of moral duty to a few educated clerics.
No. It is a constitutional mandate placed squarely on the shoulders of the entire population.
Furthermore, the words themselves carry legal weight. Amr does not mean to politely request or to preach. It means a binding command or a state order.
And nahi means a legal prohibition.
Right. Therefore, commanding good and forbidding evil is not powerless verbal preaching from a pulpit. It is the active, state-backed enforcement of universal rights and the constitutional, legal eradication of systemic wrongs.
Okay, I have to push back on the mechanics of this, though, because practically speaking, how can an entire population of millions of people constantly command good and forbid evil as a legal mandate?
It sounds impossible.
If everyone is walking around legally commanding everyone else, that sounds like absolute chaos. It sounds like mass vigilantism, where everyone is a police officer.
That is exactly why the entire system necessitates tamakun fil ard, which translates to sovereign state power.
Ah, so the people don't do it as individuals.
Exactly. The entire society mobilizes as a sovereign government. They don't do this as chaotic, vigilante individuals. They do it through a structured, unified central authority, the markaz.
So the collective will of the people, men and women participating equally, is channeled through state legislation and executive enforcement.
Because moral ideals remain entirely theoretical without a central authority possessing both the capability and the mandate to legally enforce them.
You can preach about economic fairness and the evils of hoarding wealth all day long.
But unless you have a state apparatus, a markaz, that actually collects the surplus wealth, distributes the resources to those in need, and actively outlaws and prosecutes the hoarding, your preaching is just noise.
It's just words on the wind.
Precisely. The mazhab approach creates a powerless class of clerics who merely give sermons about the rewards of the afterlife, leaving the actual political and economic systems of the present world completely in the hands of secular exploitation.
The deen, however, requires the state power to guarantee rububiyat providence to all citizens right now in this life.
So, to synthesize this entire journey we've taken today,
Yeah, let's wrap this up.
the ultimate realization here is that personal piety can never substitute for systemic justice. You cannot claim to follow the blueprint if you are a Muslim in the mosque performing rituals with perfect posture, but a ruthless capitalist in the market exploiting your workers and hoarding wealth.
Holistic submission is required. The system does not allow you to compartmentalize your life into secular and sacred domains.
Which brings us to the permanent value established in this deep dive. Throughout all the linguistic shifts, the historical analyses, and the grammatical debates, one unchanging ethical principle emerges from this text.
What's that?
Ideological unity, when inextricably combined with equitable resource distribution, is the absolute prerequisite for human survival. It is the only true remedy for societal conflict.
And a divine constitution requires a living, unified, central authority, a state, to enforce it dynamically across changing times. Mere rituals cannot save a fractured state.
We've explored how the ritual trap functions. We've unlocked the systemic meanings of ancient words, moving from historical relics to universal mental states like al-kitab.
We've seen how structural deviation, Iwaj, demagnetizes the compass of a society.
We've explored the economic engine of tethered livestock sharing provisions equally, and we've mapped out the unavoidable social physics of civilizational collapse.
It is a profound, total shift from a passive, individualistic religion to an active, collective statehood.
And so we want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought, something to mull over as you look at the structures, the institutions, and the socioeconomic realities around you today.
If the ultimate test of a society's adherence to the divine blueprint is its socioeconomic equity, and if mere rituals cannot save a fractured, starving state, what happens when the very institutions tasked with teaching this blueprint are the ones actively benefiting from the economic disparity?
What happens when the people holding the blueprints, the ones tracing the lines and leading the rituals, are getting rich off the sick people instead of building the hospital?
That is the critical, uncomfortable question. And it leads us perfectly into our next exploration. Because if sectarianism and political factionalism are literally polytheism, as the text claims, how does a modern individual actually untangle themselves from centuries of inherited mazhab to begin building this deen?
In a world dominated by individual egos and massive economic disparity, where does the individual end and where does the markaz begin?
We will have to save that massive question for our next deep dive. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Keep questioning the blueprints around you. Keep looking for the irage, that imperceptible structural deviation. And ask yourself if your compass is truly pointing toward unity or if you've been slowly led off course.
Until next time.